Welcome to Bach 101, an introduction to the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, a presentation of Music Worcester. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Shepard, the Artistic Director of The Complete Bach. Now, let's talk Bach. Hello and welcome back to Bach 101. This is our second episode. Congratulations, you got through the first one. And in a sense, it's really part B of the first episode because we're going to continue to talk about the outline of Bach's life. And as promised, we will talk in greater detail about the chronology of Bach's life. But remember what I said in the first episode. Unlike other composers, it is not really where Bach lived and worked in which years that matters the most, although that is important for different reasons that we'll talk about. But really to understand his capacious output, all of the music that he wrote, it is best to keep in mind that dichotomy that I mentioned in the first episode. The church versus the court. Was he writing sacred music for the church, or was he writing secular music for the nobility for whom he worked? Remember, this was not an era in which people wrote for their own pleasure. They were writing because they were employed by somebody to write a certain kind of music. Now with Bach, there is another element that can be overlaid on all of this, which is that he was such a great teacher. He was at heart didactic. And so some of his works, particularly the keyboard works, were also designed to teach. But nonetheless, they still fit into those larger two categories of the church and the court. There are other reasons that the chronology in Bach's life is more complicated to discuss than it is with a composer, say, like Beethoven. Now, I remember learning in music history, it was very important that you had to know about the three periods of Beethoven's compositional life. The early period, where he was indistinguishable from people like Haydn and Mozart and wrote essentially neoclassical music. The transitional middle period, where he was bringing in new ideas and working for a greater sense of, shall we say, proto-romanticism. And then the final era, the era of the Ninth Symphony, for example, was completely romantic music. He ushered in a new period himself. That is not true of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. One of the facets of his genius is that although we can't say it was a full-fledged, mature compositional style from the very beginning, it was pretty close to that. Even Mozart, whose Juvenilia we know, those young, youthful works, and Mendelssohn too, who wrote a lot as a child, they're still youthful works. You would never confuse one of Mendelssohn's early string symphonies for one of his later full symphonies. We don't really have that sense from Bach. There is another very confusing aspect to Bach's music. For so many composers, their catalog of works, which are usually described by an opus number, for example, you would say this is a string quartet by Beethoven, opus 59, number 1, something like that, or all the piano sonatas are referred to by their opus number. Bach's catalog is not like that. It was very difficult for many years to determine from Bach's scores what period of his life they came from. So instead what they did in the 19th century was to group them by type. So for example, the first couple hundred catalog numbers, which we refer to as BWV, I'll tell you why in a second. BWV 4, for example, is a cantata, Christloch in Todesbanden. Now, interestingly, we think that it might actually be quite an early work, but that's just accidental, that you could get BWV 50, which is from way later in his life than that. So that you would get the chamber music being around 1,000, you would get the organ music being in the 600s, and so on and so forth. So you get no sense of the chronology from the catalog number. Now, let me just tell you really quickly, and even this has to be difficult, doesn't it? What does BWV mean? Well, because W sounds like a V in German and a V sounds like an F, It actually stands for Bach's, now that makes sense, Werke, so that's the word for work. It starts with W though, and Verzeichnichts, which begins with a V, even though it sounds like an F, which means catalog. So BWV just means the catalog of Bach's work, BWV. And all of these pieces are referred to by their number. But I also want to take a second before we really launch into talking about where Bach worked when, to tell you the true genius of Bach's compositional style. And it is what distinguishes the very early, really it's only the very early, often keyboard works that we can say, just from listening to them, oh yes, those are early. And this is why. There were three major streams to Baroque music, particularly in the 18th century. Now, Baroque music really started in Italy, so that Italian strain was very, very strong and very, very important. But there was also the French strain that came along, particularly in the court of Louis XIV. And that had a particular meaning behind it. There was also, in Germany, a more dour, serious, very Lutheran style of composition. So there is a German style. Now, I'm about to give you a really quick primer in these three different styles. And I have done what teachers always do, which is to find quite extreme examples of each of them so you really can hear it. Now, of course, didn't work like that because people did travel and even more than that, scores were shared among musicians. So there's no such thing as perfectly only Germanic style or only French or only Italian. But as you'll hear from what I play from a man who we think may even have been one of Bach's teachers, where Bach ended up was very different from where his other German counterparts ended up. And I also apologize because this will sound so stereotypical when I say this, except it is a good, actually, thumbnail to remember them, that the Germans are very serious and very mathematical. The French are very elegant and stylized and over-embellished. And the Italians are very sunny and are much more concerned with the sense of texture and joy in the music. Those are, I've realized, very overarching, simplified things to say. But let me show you what I mean. So what did Bach get from his forebears in the area of Germany that he was from? Well, this is from Georg Böhm, who was 20 years older, 25 years older, in fact, than Bach, and we think that he may have taught him. This is a fugue based on a chorale called Christlag in Todesbanden. By the way, that's the BWV4 cantata that I just mentioned. And it's not that Böhm didn't write stuff that wasn't so Germanic, but when you hear this, you can say, oh, I can hear this strain in Bach's writing. So this is just a little keyboard fugue, but the fugue subject is, remember what I said last time about chorales, a hymn tune? This is the hymn tune. Christlag in Todesbanden. And any Lutheran who heard this would know that that's what it is. It is an Easter hymn. But then he turns it into a fugue, passing that little theme from part to part. So it starts with that subject. Next voice comes in. Then the next voice comes in. But it's pretty solid, isn't it? Last voice. I'll stop here. Now again, it's not really fair because I chose a very particularly sober piece in a minor key to represent the Germanic music, but I think it'll help you keep that in mind, that there are times when Bach will decide that he's going to write in that style, and he's sort of referring to that German style. Now, what about the French? Think about the court of the Sun King, And when you hear this piece, there was a lot of music written for the harpsichord. This almost sounds silly on the piano, but on the harpsichord, all of these ornamentations sound very, very organic. And you can hear so much of this, but in a distilled way in Bach's own writing. So this is by François Couperin, who with Rameau and Lully were the three major French composers of the Baroque. This is a little keyboard piece called L'Auguste, the august one, referring to nobility. And this was very important. Bach will often use French music to refer to royalty, because there was no greater king than Louis XIV, as Louis XIV himself would never let you forget. So listen to a little bit of this. As you can say, it's just absolutely full of ornaments. If you saw it on the page, you would see that the major notes are quite simple, but then filling everything in between is what really makes it French. And so many times, we talked about suites in the first episode, so many times that French music is based on those courtly dances that were such a huge part of life at court. And what about the Italians? Well, who do we always think of? Antonio Vivaldi and the Four Seasons. There are a couple things about Italian music that Bach absolutely absorbed. In fact, I'm about to play for you a piece by Vivaldi that Bach himself arranged. This arrangement is Bach's. He would do this almost as an apprentice. It was very common in this period that you would take somebody else's music and then do something with it so you could learn their style. It wasn't considered stealing. If anything, it was a compliment. And then later you would take those ideas and incorporate them. What are the most important ideas from Italian instrumental music? It is the idea of the concerto, which doesn't just mean that there's a solo part or a solo group, that concerto grosso that we talked about, but it's also a textural idea, that you'll have a chunk of everybody playing and then fewer people playing or singing. So you get contrast that way. The other thing, and this is hugely important to Bach's music, and it really distinguishes it from German music of the period, is that there is an opening part which is called the ritornello, and it just means, as it sounds, the part that returns. And he uses the ritornello. Let me play one for you. So it's simple music, right? It's very simple. It doesn't need to be complex. Italian music is not known for its complexity. Bach, when he puts a German fugue that you just heard, Christ lag in Todesbanden, through the meat grinder of the Italian lens of the concerto, then it becomes much more complex than Italian music, but with the ebullience of Italian music. Listen to that again. And even that piano is marked, so it's forte, then soft, loud. So it's that contrast all the time. So let me play this for you. And when I said the word solo, this is a marking that means that in the original, it would have been a solo. And I think these were all violin concerti. And I want to go far enough that you hear the ritornello again. So you get the sense that part of what Bach got from the Italians is a sense of structure. So here it is. That opening ritornello with a contrast there. You hear that repeats. There's a lot of repetition. Then the solo. New material. But even a little bit of repetition in there. Then what's this here? That's that opening ritornello. So I wanted to play that much. And even within the solo part, it's the same idea in a new key. And this is very important. This idea, I've said it before, that Bach is encyclopedic. He wants to gather together all that is possible. Another E word, he is very economical. He will take one idea and then exploit it through repetition and inversion and variation and all of these things. That is baked into the Italian style. So now, as we launch into the exact chronology of Bach's own life, where he lived and where he worked, when, let's keep in mind these two huge overarching ideas. One that I introduced last time, which is the church versus the court. And now what I'm saying here is that his style is an amalgamation of the German, the French, and the Italian. And those two things rule everything that we look at. It is the prism through which we view Bach's music and his chronology. First, the geography. Bach lived and worked in a small area, a huge contrast with his exact contemporary Handel, born about 75 miles from Bach. Bach spent most of his life in the state of Thuringia, which is smack in the center of Germany. Now, he did travel around that area, particularly when he would give organ concerts or consult about the construction or redesign of organs, for which he was highly respected. The one major trip that he took was to the northern port city of Lübeck to hear the famous organist Dietrich Buxtehude. On that trip, he walked an amazing 200 miles in each direction. Next, in looking at Bach's employers, we should make a broad point about musicians in this pre-Romantic era. They were servants at worst, closely managed employees at best. And those two main employers, the church and the court, the nobility, they were intertwined throughout Bach's career. He may have bridled at their heavy-handed power over him from time to time, but his situation was hardly unique, and it is no reflection on Bach himself. Now, we can dispense with his first three jobs in short order, not because they were unimportant, but because their importance is dwarfed by his three later major jobs. It was in those three places, the early jobs, for the record, Weimar, Arnstadt, and Mühlhausen, that Bach was first recognized for his extraordinary organ skills and where he learned his trade. And I should say it was in those early places that his music was most like North German music, though he was at this point already absorbing the French and the Italian into his style. But it's the final three jobs that bear the most scrutiny, since it was there that Bach wrote the vast bulk of his compositions. Do you remember Weimar, which I mentioned in the first episode? He had only worked there for a very short time, serving as a lowly court musician and probably even having some non-musical servant-type jobs. Well, he returned there in 1708, so around the age of 23, first as an organist, and later in the important role of Concertmeister. From there, he moved to the court of Prince Leopold in Cöthen in 1717, so Weimar and then Cöthen. And he was in Weimar longer, nearly a decade in Weimar, and then Cöthen only about 6 years in all. Now let's take those two appointments to noble households as one stretch. So in Weimar and Cöthen, he was working for nobility from 1708 to 1723. So this is the age of 23 to 38. And I would like to say, remember how I said in the first episode, how are you like Bach? You might say that in your life, those were the years of your greatest advancement and where you learned the most about your job. Now, Bach did write some church music, some cantatas, and some organ music during this period, but probably no more than 30 cantatas in Weimar. That court was Lutheran, so Bach was heavily involved in the chapel there in Weimar. But in Cöthen, the court was Calvinist, and he didn't really write sacred music for those services. Now, we are not, I promise you, not going to go down the rabbit hole of all of the religious strands in the Holy Roman Empire in this period. But you've got to remember, Bach was born only about 30-ish years, 30, 40 years after the 30 Years' War, which really did pit the Catholics against the Lutherans and the Calvinists. There were these two strands in Protestantism. And Bach's life, he bumped up against all of those. And he never worked for a Catholic court, but he did have a little bit to do with the Catholic court in Dresden. So all of that was part of the landscape in Germany in the 18th century. So it's useful for us to think of those two of the three later jobs, Weimar and Cöthen, as Bach's instrumental years, not his choral years. As organist in Weimar, for example, he wrote a great deal of his organ output. He also wrote his Well-Tempered Clavier, that astonishing collection of keyboard prelude and fugue pairs that we talked about in the first episode in Weimar. So we can think of Weimar as the keyboard years. So that makes Cöthen the other instrumental years. Prince Leopold, his boss, was a great lover of music himself, and he kept an excellent group of professional musicians working for him in the Cöthen court. And because that austere Calvinist church, not Lutheran, this was a Calvinist church, didn't require Bach to compose weekly cantatas, Bach was free to concentrate on instrumental music, particularly solo, chamber, and larger ensemble works. So it's from this period in Cöthen, that some of Bach's most popular works come. The 6 suites for solo cello, the sonatas and partitas for solo violin, the 4 orchestral suites, and perhaps the orchestral works for which he is best known, the Brandenburg Concerti. These years were happy and productive ones for Bach. His employer was very supportive, his musicians were first-rate, and his young family grew during his Cöthen years. The happiness, however, was marred by the death of Bach's first wife, Maria Barbara, while he was on tour with the Prince in 1720. He married Anna Magdalena, that wonderful singer from the court, the following year, only 2 years before the final move to Leipzig. On paper, it should have been his dream job. As a devout Lutheran, Bach thought of himself first and foremost as a minister of music. So a job in Leipzig, this job that encompassed providing music for 4 churches each week, as well as overseeing a choir of schoolboys and a professional orchestra, should have given him great pleasure. However, as I said at the start of episode 1, he was ultimately really dissatisfied with the number and quality of the singers at his disposal. And from quite early in his tenure, it feels as if it was battle after battle with his bosses. And boy, he had plenty of bosses in Leipzig. Since the job was both as a musician and a teacher, he reported directly to the rector of the church and the headmaster of the school. But to make it worse, he was also supervised by the town council, a powerful group of burghers in a city that was justly proud of its 3 annual fairs, making it one of the Holy Roman Empire's most important economic centers. You get the impression that they thought really highly of themselves, these church fathers and town council members, and they were always difficult in their encounters with Bach, rarely approving the expenditures he requested. And by the way, they didn't even want Bach in the first place. He was the third choice for that job, which to us seems absolutely insane. But in spite of this, his first several years in Leipzig were incredibly busy and compositionally fulfilling. As we'll discuss in one of the next episodes, he composed at a superhuman rate, writing virtually one new cantata each week for those first 3 years. Can you imagine that? A new 25 to 30-minute work each week. And we'll talk about the ways in which that is even more difficult than it sounds. Now, he did rework. Remember I said that he had written about 30 cantatas in Weimar? He did rework some of those, but honestly, that's 30 out of nearly 200 in all. In doing this, Bach was trying to complete a massive task that he set for himself. He wanted to write a cantata for each Sunday to accompany the 3-year repeating cycle of Sunday Bible readings set by the church. In sheer volume, this was the most impressive of all of Bach's encyclopedic projects, representing about half of his entire output. As I say, more on that later, but for now, just say to yourself, my gosh, who could do that? Now, as if that wasn't enough, these were also the years in which he wrote his major choral works, the Magnificat, the St. Matthew and St. John Passions, the 6 motets, the Christmas Oratorio, and parts of the B minor Mass. These works are at the very heart of the Western choral canon, complicated but beautiful, difficult but powerful. I've conducted all of these works, and I can vouch for the fact that they are worth all the blood, sweat, and tears, mostly my blood, sweat, and tears, that it takes to master Bach's music. Taken together with the cantatas, they represent a universe of musical and theological thought. I would suggest that these vocal works, even more than his glorious instrumental pieces, give us the true glimpse into the capacious mind of this musical genius. But yes, the instrumental works nonetheless remain extraordinary. I know that I just said that it's helpful to think of Weimar and Cöthen as the instrumental years, and this is certainly true, but it should also be said that in the last 15 years of his life in Leipzig, Bach increasingly turned away from writing new choral pieces, though he continued to present them, of course. That was part of why he created the Encyclopedia of Works, so that they could be used as the cycles ran through. Instead, he returned to writing instrumental music again. In terms of organ works, he wrote some truly major works, including the Great 18 Chorale Preludes and also the Great Organ Mass. For keyboard, which is more harpsichord, he wrote a second book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, the Partitas, the Italian Concerto, and the extraordinarily complex Goldberg variations. It is widely thought that Bach partly turned towards keyboard composition again because he was so dissatisfied with the lack of support the church council gave him for his choirs in Leipzig. But these works also reflect that encyclopedic tendency that we keep discussing in Bach's works, his desire to draw together collections that show all the possibilities in Baroque composition. This was also where he wrote 2 of his most sophisticated works, The Art of the Fugue and The Musical Offering, again, encyclopedic works. Another reason for his burst of instrumental writing provided great joy for Bach. In 1729, he became director of the town's Collegium Musicum, a town gown ensemble with players and singers from the University of Leipzig, as well as some of the town's professional musicians. Georg Philipp Telemann had founded this group as a student, and it played at Zimmermann's Coffee House. Bach reworked many concerti during this period, and he presented the secular, that is, the non-sacred cantatas. These were usually command performances of celebratory works, often to celebrate the name day or the birthday of local nobility. You get the sense that this ensemble, this Collegium Musicum, finally provided Bach the break from church politics that he needed, and it gave him an outlet for both composition and the re-airing of successful pieces from his past. And remember how I talked very early in that first episode about how much he seems to have loved his sons and supported them? We think that so many of the harpsichord concerti from this period, for 2, 3, and even 4 harpsichords, were written for his sons and played at Zimmermann's Coffee House with the Collegium Musicum. In his very final years, Bach experienced more than his share of indignities, both professionally and personally. He was increasingly seen as out of touch with modern musical trends, a charge that was not entirely true and which he refuted strenuously. And sadly, he began to lose his eyesight as early as in his 50s as a result of cataracts. He was treated by the same traveling eye surgeon who blinded George Frederick Handel only a couple years later. The surgery wasn't successful, it hardly ever was, and it resulted in a great deal of pain, for which Bach was treated and bedridden. 4 months after the surgery, in 1750, in severe pain the entire time, Bach died of a stroke. That's the chronology, remembering in particular Weimar, Cöthen, and Leipzig, those 3 really important places where he worked from the age of 23 to when he died at 65. Dividing them in 2, the Weimar and Cöthen were largely more instrumental, Leipzig, the site of his great production of the church cantatas. So here we are. We've come to the end of a 2-episode chronology just to kick things off. What will you hear about for the rest of Bach 101, this 12-episode mini course in the music of Bach? Well, as promised, over the next 5 episodes, we're going to do a deeper dive into each genre of music. The choral music, the organ music, the keyboard, or really harpsichord, piano music, the chamber music, and the orchestral music, so that you will get a sense of what you're going to hear over the next 11 years in each of those categories. And then I want to also talk about how Bach approached different forms. In particular, the suites, that dance music that is at the core of what he wrote. The fugue, as I've said, you can't understand Bach till you understand a fugue. And then I gave you just a little bit of a preview today about the importance of the concerto in Bach's writing. Not just writing a concerto for harpsichord and orchestra, but concerto elements, particularly the ritornello, in so much of his music, including all the way through his cantatas. And then finally, just a couple little episodes that you might even think of more as Bach 201, slightly more advanced, where we can delve more deeply into those 3 national styles, the German, the French, and the Italian, and what Baroque music was overall, what Bach inherited and what he then improved upon. Then I want to talk to you about performance practice and how everything has changed so much, particularly over the last 50 years. And then just a little bit of a glimpse into the mind of Bach. We can pick apart a couple pieces so you can see that third E that we talked about, that economical, that he's encyclopedic and that he is economical, and finally, that he is enigmatic. He was a composer for whom puzzles were so important, and we will talk about how so many ideas, particularly Lutheran theology, are encoded in his music. Oh, there's so much to do, isn't there? But you should be congratulated for getting through the first 2 episodes of Bach 101, and there is no exam, so you can just keep listening and keep enjoying. I can't wait until you join me for episode 3, when once again we will talk Bach. See you then. Thank you.